How are you guys doing? Today is Tuesday, January 11th, 2022. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do a championship profile for the 2021 and now 22 Georgia Bulldogs football team that came into this year with being a full team that was recruited by their head coach, Kirby Smart, and they went all the way to the end, going undefeated for the regular season, suffering their only loss in the SEC championship game, yet still rebounding and winning both of their college football playoff games to cement themselves as national champs. This is the third time that they have claimed a national title. The other 2 years that they claimed it were in 1942 and in 1980. This is the first time in 41 years that they had won it. And I know, being from the state of Georgia, that everybody in that state, in my state, is going to be celebrating through the next decade, millennium, doesn't even matter. They saw Georgia win this one time. So taking a look at how Georgia won each and every game, looking at the path that Georgia took to get here. In their very first matchup, they were the 5th ranked team in the nation as they ended up beating the 3rd ranked Clemson Tigers 10-3. Their lone touchdown coming off of a 74-yard pick six from Christopher Smith. Their starting quarterback this matchup was JT Daniels. He ended up throwing for 135 yards, and Zamir White had 74 yards for himself. Following this low-scoring game, of course, Georgia would end up as 1-0. In their next matchup, they would get moved up to the number 2 ranked team in the nation as they ended up defeating unranked UAB, University of Alabama, Birmingham. They won this matchup 56-7. Stetson Bennett threw for 5 touchdowns this game as he threw for 288 yards. Brock Bowers would finish with over 100 yards receiving as he had 2 receiving touchdowns for himself. Following, and of course, on the defensive side of the ball, Georgia was led in tackles by Channing Tindall as he was able to add a sack for himself. Following this matchup, Georgia would be 2-0, going into their third matchup against unranked South Carolina as the 2nd ranked team in the nation. Georgia would win this matchup 40-13 as they were able to get a lot of help from JT Daniels, who threw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading receiver this matchup was Adonai Mitchell as he had 77 yards through the air. Not to mention that Nolan Smith led the defense in Game 3 as he was able to finish with 8 tackles himself. Following this matchup, Georgia ended up as a 3-0 team. In their third matchup, the number 2 ranked Bulldogs would go to Vanderbilt, and in this matchup, they shut Vanderbilt out completely, 62-0. Brock Bowers would finish with 2 touchdowns in the first quarter and 3 touchdowns for the entire game. Stetson Bennett threw for 150 yards as JT Daniels threw for 130 yards himself, and not to mention that on the defensive side, they had a bunch of players with 3 tackles each. Following this matchup, Georgia was 4-0. Jumping into their 5th matchup, they would face off against their 2nd top 10 team. They faced off against the 8th-ranked Arkansas Razorbacks. They would completely shut Arkansas out 32-0 for the entire game. They were led this matchup by their rushers as they've combined for a total 273 yards of rushing offense. Zamir White had 68 yards on the ground as he had 2 touchdowns. And then on the defensive side, Devontae Wyatt and Nakobe Dean each had a sack and a half. Following this win, the 2nd-ranked Bulldogs were undefeated going into Game 6 as they were 3-0 in the SEC. In their 6th game, they would face off against the 18th-ranked Auburn Tigers in Auburn, and they would finish this matchup 6-0. They beat Auburn 34-10. I'm sorry. They were led by their starting quarterback, Stetson Bennett, who threw for 230 yards and 2 touchdowns. Zamir White finished with 2 touchdowns on the ground. Ladd McConkey had 135 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. And not to mention, Nakobe Dean also had an interception this game. Following this matchup, Georgia was sitting at 6-0. In their 7th matchup, they would face off against their 3rd ranked team in a row as they faced off at home against the 11th ranked Kentucky Wildcats. They would end up beating Kentucky 30-13 to jump up to 7-0. No scoring in the first quarter would lead to Georgia having to systemically just dominate Kentucky. Stetson Bennett threw for 250 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air. Brock Bowers had 100 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Quay Walker led the team with 9 tackles. Following this game, Georgia would be 7-0 after beating 3 top 25 teams in a row, all coming out of the SEC. Their next matchup will be against Florida, where they ended up beating the unranked Florida Gators at the Jacksonville matchup. They ended up scoring 24 points in the second quarter as they got their touchdowns from James Cook and Kearis Jackson on offense. Nakobe Dean would finish with a 50-yard pick six, and Zamir White had 100 yards on the ground, just to give a sense of how well-rounded Georgia was on offense and defense. Following this matchup, Georgia would be 8-0 as they were 6-0 in the SEC. In their ninth matchup, they would face off against the unranked Mizzou Tigers as they finally took over as the number one team after Alabama lost on a field goal to Texas A&M. Georgia would win this matchup by 37 after Stetson Bennett threw for 255 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jermaine Burton was their leading receiver as he had 76 yards and a touchdown for himself. And then following this matchup, they would go into their 10th game as an undefeated team. And in their 10th game, they would end up going to Tennessee and beating the Volunteers 41-17 as they jumped to 8-0 in the conference at that point. They were led by Stetson Bennett, who threw for 213 yards and a touchdown. James Cook had 104 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. He even had 43 yards and a touchdown through the air, so he had 147 total yards of offense and 3 touchdowns. Their leading tackler, Nakobe Dean, had 11 tackles and a sack, as Channing Tindall had 8 tackles and 3 sacks on the day. Following this win, Georgia would go on to go undefeated in their SEC regular season, so they had won the SEC East title and had secured the spot for them to play in the SEC championship game. In their 11th game, they hosted the unranked Charleston Southern Buccaneers. They won this matchup 56-7 to jump up to 11-0. In this matchup, Stetson Bennett threw for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. Zamir White had 83 yards on the ground. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Javon Bullard and Jamon Dumas-Johnson finished with the team's lead in tackles. So following this game, Georgia would be 56-7. That would be their last game that they would play in the Athens Stadium. And then their last game of the year, they went to Atlanta to shut out the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets 45-0 in this cross-state rivalry. This game, they were led by Stetson Bennett. Bennett threw for 255 yards and 4 touchdowns. Brock Bowers caught 2 of them as he had 100 receiving yards for the day. And then not to mention that Georgia did combine for 3 sacks on the other end as Nakobe Dean led the team in tackles. Following the regular season, Georgia did go into the college football playoff with the number 1 rank, or I guess they went into the SEC championship that year, where they would face off against the 3rd-ranked Alabama Crimson Tide in the SEC championship game in Atlanta. Alabama would end up beating Georgia 41-24 as Alabama outscored Georgia by a touchdown in the first half, and they outscored Georgia by 10 in the second half. This game, Georgia was led by Stetson Bennett as Bennett threw for 340 yards and 3 touchdowns alongside 2 interceptions. Brock Bowers had 139 receiving yards through the air as well as a receiving touchdown. And following this loss, Georgia would still find themselves in the top 4 as they would end up switching spots with Alabama as Alabama took the 1 seed. Georgia would take the 3 seed, and they would go into the college football playoff to face off against the 2nd seed Michigan Wolverines in the Capital One Orange Bowl after Michigan had destroyed Iowa in the Big Ten championship game. In this matchup, Georgia would end up beating Michigan 34-11 as they had Michigan up. They were up 34-3 over Michigan, looking at how they scored in the college football playoff. In the first quarter, Stetson Bennett would throw a 9-yard touchdown pass to Brock Bowers to make it 7-0, and then Kenny McIntosh threw an 18-yard touchdown pass to Adonai Mitchell to make it 14-0. In the second quarter, Georgia started off with a field goal to make it 17-0. Michigan scored a field goal, and then Georgia scored another field goal to make it 20-3. They ended the second quarter off of a 57-yard touchdown pass from Stetson Bennett to Jermaine Burton, making it 27-3 going into halftime. After neither team scored in the third, Georgia would go up 34-3 off of a 39 touchdown pass from Stetson Bennett to James Cook. And then Michigan scored its lone touchdown with 4.5 minutes to go off of the 35-yard touchdown pass from J.J. McCarthy to Andre Anthony. Following this win, Georgia, of course, would find themselves in position to play against Alabama yesterday. And coming in, Georgia was actually favored as Alabama was the slight underdog despite having beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. And then taking a look out to Georgia's final game of this 2021 campaign, they would end up beating the first-ranked Alabama Crimson Tide 33-18. Taking a look at how the scoring went in this matchup, Alabama scored first. In the first quarter, they kicked a field goal 37 yards out from Will Reichard. The second quarter would start with Georgia kicking a field goal to tie it up at 3. Alabama would make 2 straight field goals to go up 9-3. Georgia would go into the half, making another field goal. So Alabama led this game 9-6 going into halftime. Georgia would end up taking the lead off of a Zamir White 1-yard touchdown to make it 13-9. Alabama would start the fourth quarter with a field goal to put themselves down by 1. It was 13-12 at this point. In their next drive, Bryce Young would throw a 3-yard touchdown pass to Cameron Latu to give Alabama the lead back. They were up 18-13, up by 5 with 10 minutes left. Stetson Bennett would throw a 40-yard touchdown pass to Adonai Mitchell with about 8 minutes left to put Georgia up by 1. With about 3.5 minutes left, Stetson Bennett would throw another 15-yard pass to Brock Bowers for a touchdown to put them up by 8, which was still a one-possession game. And then with Alabama driving, Bryce Young would end up throwing a pick 6 as Kelee Ringo would return it 79 yards to the house. Taking a look at how both teams fared on the losing end, Alabama was led by their Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Bryce Young, who threw for 369 yards and a touchdown. On the winning end, the Georgia Bulldogs were led by their starting quarterback, Stetson Bennett. He completed 17 of his 26 passes as he threw for 224 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher, Zamir White, had 13 carries for 84 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Their second leading rusher, James Cook, had 77 yards on 6 carries. He also had 2 receptions for 15 yards, so he had 92 total yards of offense on the day. Their leading receiver, George Pickens, had 1 52-yard reception. Their second leading receiver, Adonai Mitchell, had 2 receptions for 50 yards and a receiving touchdown. Their third leading receiver, Brock Bowers, had 4 receptions for 36 yards as he had the team's other receiving touchdown. On the defensive side of the ball, Quay Walker led the team in tackles as he had 8 of them, alongside Channing Tindall. Tindall finished with one of the team's sacks. So did Nolan Smith, Robert Beal Jr., and Trayvon Walker. And Christopher Smith would have his interception alongside his 7 tackles. Kelee Ringo finished with 6 tackles as he had the 79-yard pick 6 that cemented this game for the Georgia Bulldogs. And for now, until the end of time, the 2021 Georgia Bulldogs team will be remembered as champions. Is definitely in a season where they beat Alabama from within their own conference, the SEC, to do it. Congratulations to the 2021 Georgia Bulldogs and the Alabama Crimson Tide, for that matter. I hope all is well, and hopefully by this time next year, we'll see we'll see if there is a different champion, or we'll see if Georgia repeats. Thanks for listening to this piece. I want to thank ESPN and every website that I've been using for this entire collegiate football season to help me with this episode. I hope all is well, and I'll catch everyone with another piece tomorrow. Peace out.